History is not just written by the victors. It is also shaped by what is erased. And no erasure was more absolute than the life of Archduke Albrecht Franz. He was born to be a living monument to the wealth and power of the Habsburg dynasty. But 2 world wars and 3 dictatorships did not kill him. They did something crueler. They made him invisible. This is not the story of a prince who fought and lost. This is an analysis of an assassination by circumstance, of how the storms of the 20th century could strip a man of everything, his title, his homeland, his fortune, only to leave behind a living ghost of a world that no longer existed. To truly grasp the monumental height from which Archduke Albrecht would eventually fall, we must first immerse ourselves in the world that created him, the Austro-Hungarian Empire of the late 1890s. On the surface, it was a dazzling spectacle of power and tradition. At its head sat Emperor Franz Joseph I, a figure who seemed less a man and more a permanent institution. By the time of Albrecht's birth, the emperor had already been on the throne for nearly half a century, a stern, whiskered patriarch in a crisp white uniform, embodying the virtues of duty, discipline, and divine right. His was an empire of Baroque palaces, of military parades where thousands of soldiers marched in perfect unison, and of glittering court balls in Vienna, where the waltzes of Johann Strauss spun the aristocracy into a dizzying fantasy of eternal grandeur. But this magnificent facade concealed a structure riddled with deep and ultimately fatal cracks. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was not a nation-state in the modern sense. It was a patchwork quilt of peoples, a multi-ethnic conglomeration of Germans, Magyars, Hungarians, Czechs, Poles, Slovaks, Croats, Serbs, Romanians, and many others, all bound together by little more than their shared allegiance to the Habsburg crown. This delicate balance was maintained by the complex political arrangement known as the dual monarchy, established by the Ausgleich, or Compromise of 1867. This accord had split the empire into 2 halves, the Austrian-led western part and the Hungarian-dominated eastern part, each with its own parliament and government, united only by the person of the emperor-king. It was a pragmatic solution to quell Hungarian nationalism, but it left the empire's other ethnic groups, particularly the Slavs, feeling like second-class citizens. In the coffee houses of Prague, Budapest, and Zagreb, whispers of independence were growing louder, fueled by a rising tide of nationalism that was sweeping across Europe. The empire was a beautiful, ornate prison whose gilded bars were beginning to rust from within, and its inmates were starting to smell the scent of freedom on the wind. Within this precarious political landscape, the Habsburg dynasty itself was a world unto its own. For over 600 years, they had been the masters of Central Europe, their power built on strategic marriages, unwavering Catholic faith, and an unshakable belief in their own God-given right to rule. By the late 19th century, they presided over a court in Vienna that was arguably the most formal and tradition-bound in all of Europe. Life was a theatrical performance governed by centuries-old etiquette, where the angle of a bow or the placement of a fork at a state dinner carried profound political meaning. It was into this world that the Teschen branch of the Habsburg-Lorraine dynasty had carved out a unique and incredibly powerful niche. While they were not in the direct line of succession to the imperial throne, they had amassed a private fortune that dwarfed that of many reigning monarchs. Their story began in the 18th century, but their wealth exploded in the 19th with the Industrial Revolution. Their ancestral seat, the Duchy of Teschen in Austrian Silesia, was rich in coal and other resources. While other aristocrats were content to live off their agricultural rents, the Dukes of Teschen had embraced modernity. They became industrial capitalists, investing heavily in mining, steel production, railways, and, most famously, brewing. The Żywiec brewery, founded by an earlier Archduke Albrecht, became one of the largest and most famous in Europe, its beer exported across the continent. This fusion of ancient lineage and modern industry made the Teschen line uniquely powerful. Their head, Archduke Friedrich, was not just a cousin of the emperor. He was one of the empire's most important economic figures. He was a field marshal in the army, a pillar of the establishment, and a man whose personal wealth gave him an influence that extended far beyond his military rank. He was the embodiment of the Habsburg ideal, a soldier, a devout Catholic, a great landowner, and a stern patriarch who ruled his own family with the same disciplined authority he expected from his troops. His wife, Princess Isabella of Croy, was the perfect partner for such a man. The House of Croy was one of the oldest and most distinguished noble families in Europe, with roots stretching back to the Middle Ages, in France and the Low Countries. Isabella brought to the marriage not only an impeccable pedigree, but also a deep, unwavering Catholic faith and a sophisticated pan-European worldview. She was a formidable woman in her own right, a society hostess of great renown, and a mother who was fiercely dedicated to upholding the traditions and advancing the interests of her family. Together, Friedrich and Isabella presided over a household that was a microcosm of the empire itself, immensely wealthy, rigidly structured, and dedicated to the preservation of the old order. Their primary residence in the capital was the Palais Erzherzog Albrecht, a palatial city home located in the heart of Vienna's government district. Its famous Albertina art collection was a testament to the family's cultural sophistication, but their true power base lay in their vast land holdings, estates in Silesia, Moravia, and especially Hungary, which were managed with industrial efficiency and generated a colossal income. For nearly 2 decades, this powerful couple produced a string of daughters. One after another, 8 girls were born, each a valuable asset to be married off into the great noble and royal houses of Europe, weaving the Teschen line ever more deeply into the fabric of the continent's aristocracy. But as the years passed, a quiet anxiety must have grown within the family. In a world governed by inheritance through the male line, a dynasty without a son is a dynasty without a future. The entire weight of this colossal fortune, this historic legacy, was waiting for a male heir. Then on a summer day, the 24th of July, 1897, at the family's summer palace of Schloss Weilburg in Baden by Wien, the wait was finally over. After 8 daughters, Princess Isabella gave birth to a healthy, vibrant baby boy. The future of the Teschen line was secure. He was given a name that was both a prayer and a proclamation: Albrecht Franz Joseph, Karl Friedrich, Georg Hubert Maria von Österreich. Each name was a link in a chain of history. Albrecht honored the great 19th century Archduke who had been a military hero and had consolidated the family's fortune. Franz Joseph was a clear tribute to the reigning emperor, a gesture of loyalty and deference. The other names connected him to a host of royal ancestors and patron saints, reinforcing his identity as a prince of Catholic Europe. The inclusion of Hubert Maria, a specific request of his devout mother, underscored the deep piety that was expected to guide his life. From the moment of his birth, Albrecht was different. He was not just another child, he was the sole focus of his parents' dynastic hopes, the singular inheritor of a legacy of power and wealth that had been built over generations. He was born into a world of unimaginable opulence, but it was a world that came with a crushing weight of expectation. His destiny, it seemed, was already written. He would be a soldier, a landowner, a pillar of the Habsburg Empire, and he would carry the name and fortune of the House of Tesshan into the 20th century. But the 20th century would have other plans, and the glorious world he was born to inherit was already living on borrowed time. The childhood of Archduke Albrecht was an existence of almost surreal privilege, a life carefully insulated from the grimy realities of the industrial world that funded it. His universe was a constellation of magnificent palaces and estates, each one a self-contained world of luxury and order. He took his first steps on the polished parquet floors of the Palais Erzherzog Albrecht in Vienna, a residence so grand it contained its own art museum. He learned to ride a pony on the endless manicured lawns of his family's Hungarian manors, such as the grand estate at Magyarovar. He spent his summers at Schloss Weilburg, a romantic castle-like villa nestled in the scenic Hellenintal Valley, a playground for the empire's elite. Life in these residences was a masterpiece of aristocratic logistics, run by a veritable army of servants, tutors, governesses, and staff. Every hour of the young Archduke's day was scheduled and supervised. His education was not left to a public institution, but was entrusted to a team of private tutors, carefully selected to instill in him the values and skills deemed essential for a man of his station. His curriculum was a formidable blend of the classical and the practical. He was drilled in languages, becoming fluent in the German of the court, the French of international diplomacy, and the Hungarian of his future tenants. He studied history, not as a dry academic subject, but as the living story of his own ancestors, a chronicle of battles won, territories gained, and a dynasty's enduring glory. His mother, Isabella, took a particular interest in his religious and moral upbringing. The inclusion of Maria in his name was no mere formality. It was a sign of the family's deep devotion to the Virgin Mary and the Catholic Church. Albrecht was raised in an atmosphere of sincere piety, with daily prayers, regular attendance at Mass, and instruction in Catholic doctrine forming a central pillar of his education. This foundation of faith would remain with him throughout his life, a source of solace and certainty in a world where everything else would eventually be stripped away. But the most important aspect of his education was, without a doubt, the military. For a Habsburg Archduke, an army career was not a choice, it was a destiny. From a young age, he was dressed in miniature military uniforms and taught the principles of discipline and command. He learned to fence, to shoot, and to master the complex art of horsemanship, not merely as sports, but as the essential skills of an officer and a gentleman. The plan was clear. Upon reaching maturity, he would be commissioned into one of the elite regiments of the Imperial and Royal Army, and would follow in his father's footsteps, dedicating his life to the service of the Emperor and the Empire. However, Albrecht's childhood was defined by one overwhelming and inescapable fact. He was the only boy. After 8 daughters, his arrival was seen as a miracle, a divine gift ensuring the continuation of the family line. This placed him in an extraordinary and psychologically complex position. He was, without question, the most important child in the household, the son around which his 8 older sisters orbited. He was doted on, protected, and undoubtedly spoiled. His every success was celebrated, his every need catered to. But this privileged status was a gilded cage. He was not a boy, but a dynastic asset, forced to carry the colossal weight of his own inheritance on his small shoulders. Not just the abstract ambitions of his parents, but the literal weight of palaces, coal mines, and breweries. It's possible that this environment, where he was both adored and scrutinized, contributed to his later preference for a quieter, more private life. away from the constant glare of public duty. As he grew from a boy into a young man, the idyllic world of his youth began to show signs of strain. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, for all its outward splendor, was a cauldron of ethnic tensions. The rigid social hierarchy that placed a German-speaking elite at the top was increasingly resented by the Hungarians, Czechs, Poles, and other Slavic peoples who made up the majority of the population. While Albrecht was practicing his French and learning to waltz, young men in the Balkans were joining secret societies and plotting revolution. The peace that had defined the Belle Époque was a fragile illusion, and the elaborate network of royal alliances, which saw Albrecht related to nearly every monarch in Europe, was proving to be a web of rivalries rather than a guarantee of stability. In the summer of 1914, that illusion was shattered forever. The assassination of his distant cousin, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, in Sarajevo, triggered a diplomatic crisis that spiraled out of control with terrifying speed. One by one, the great powers of Europe declared war on each other, dragged into the abyss by a system of rigid alliances and imperial ambitions. The cataclysm that would become known as the Great War had begun. For the 17-year-old Archduke Albrecht, the carefree days of his youth were over. The theoretical military training he had received since childhood was about to become a brutal reality. Following the hallowed tradition of his family, he was immediately called to serve. His father, Archduke Friedrich, was elevated to the position of supreme commander of the entire Austro-Hungarian military machine, placing him at the very top of the imperial war effort. Albrecht was commissioned as a lieutenant and sent to the front. His presence there was a powerful piece of propaganda. He was the handsome young Archduke, the son of the commander-in-chief, sharing the dangers of the trenches with the common soldiers. It was a potent symbol of dynastic leadership and national unity in an army that was a fragile mosaic of different ethnicities and languages. He served with distinction, witnessing the carnage on the Italian and Russian fronts, and learned the harsh lessons of modern, industrialized warfare. He was no longer the protected boy of the Viennese palaces. He was a soldier in a war that was consuming his entire world. For 4 years, he served as the empire bled. But no amount of symbolic leadership could save the crumbling edifice. The staggering losses, the starvation at home, and the unstoppable pull of nationalism were tearing the ancient empire apart. In the autumn of 1918, the war was lost. The Austro-Hungarian Empire disintegrated in a matter of weeks. On November 11th, Emperor Karl, the last Habsburg ruler, issued a proclamation renouncing his role in government. It was not a formal abdication, but the meaning was clear. After more than 6 centuries, the rule of the House of Habsburg was over. For Albrecht, now a young man of 21, the defeat was not just a political event. It was a personal apocalypse. In a flash, he had lost everything that had defined his existence. He was no longer an archduke of a powerful empire. The new Austrian Republic passed the punitive Habsburg law, which banished his family and confiscated their properties. His ancestral homeland, the Duchy of Teschen, the very source of his family's identity and wealth, was violently torn apart, its territory divided between the new states of Poland and Czechoslovakia. The future he had been preparing for his entire life, a future of military command, of managing vast estates, of taking his place at the apex of European society, had vanished. The golden cage had not just been unlocked, but vaporized around him. He was thrown out not into a new world, but into its margins, his existence suddenly as relevant as a king on a discarded playing card. He was a prince with no principality, an archduke with no empire, an heir to an echo. The first great tragedy of his life was complete, and he was forced to begin anew, a ghost of a lost world, searching for a foothold in the uncertain and unforgiving landscape of post-war Europe. The world he was raised to command no longer existed. Now, like millions of others, he was a survivor adrift in a new and hostile Europe, a continent redrawn by treaties and defined by loss. The immediate question was not one of dynastic ambition, but of simple survival. Where could a Habsburg now go? The end of the Great War was not an armistice. It was a detonation that shattered a continent and blew 4 great empires to dust. For the 21-year-old Archduke Albrecht, who had marched off to war as a prince of the venerable House of Habsburg, the world he returned to was unrecognizable. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, the multi-ethnic behemoth that had dominated Central Europe for centuries, had vanished from the map, replaced by a constellation of small, quarrelsome, and fiercely nationalistic successor states. His imperial titles were now meaningless legal fictions. His Austrian citizenship had been revoked by a hostile new republic, and his ancestral home, the vast and wealthy Duchy of Teschen, had been carved up and consumed by the new nations of Poland and Czechoslovakia. He was a general without an army, a landlord without land, an heir without an inheritance. The past was a foreign country, and the future was a terrifying blank. This was the crisis that confronted not just Albrecht, but the entire Habsburg clan. Banished from their Austrian homeland by the punitive Habsburg law of 1919, which demanded they renounce all dynastic claims or face permanent exile, they were forced to scatter. For Albrecht's family, the Teschen line, the most logical refuge, lay to the east, in the one part of the former empire where their names still commanded respect and where they still held a significant portion of their immense fortune, Hungary. But the Hungary they fled to was itself a nation traumatized and reeling from its own series of cataclysms. In the final days of the war, Hungary had broken away from Austria, declaring itself an independent republic. This was swiftly followed by the rise of the brutal Hungarian Soviet Republic under the communist dictator Bela Kun, whose Red Terror saw aristocrats, intellectuals, and political opponents rounded up and executed. This short-lived but bloody regime was in turn crushed by an invading Romanian army, which occupied and looted Budapest. When the dust finally settled in 1920, a new leader had emerged from the chaos, Admiral Miklos Horthy, a former commander in the Austro-Hungarian Navy. Horthy, a staunch conservative and anti-communist, crushed the last vestiges of the revolution in his own White Terror and set about establishing a new political order. The solution he devised was a paradox that perfectly captured the nation's conflicted soul. Hungary was officially declared a kingdom once more, but the throne remained empty. The last Habsburg emperor, Karl, had attempted to reclaim his Hungarian crown twice in 1921, but Horthy, fearing an invasion from Hungary's hostile neighbors, had rebuffed him and sent him into his final exile. Instead, Horthy declared himself regent, the head of a kingless kingdom, a placeholder for a monarch who would never be allowed to return. This created a deeply conservative, nationalistic, and aristocratic state, a society that mourned its lost king and its lost territories, which had been savagely curtailed by the punitive Treaty of Trianon. It was a nation haunted by the ghosts of its past glory, and it was in this strange, melancholic land that Archduke Albrecht would attempt to build a new life from the ruins of the old. For the Teschen family, the transition to life in Hungary was a strange mix of privilege and loss. while they had been stripped of their Austrian and Silesian holdings. Their Hungarian estates remained largely intact, making them overnight one of the most powerful and wealthy families in the new nation. They were no longer subjects of a sprawling empire, but they were now magnates in a smaller but deeply traditional kingdom. It was here, in this second act of his life, that Albrecht would shed the skin of the boyish archduke and forge a new identity as a pragmatic landowner, a conservative politician, and a man grappling with the conflicting demands of a hollowed-out legacy and his own personal desires. Upon settling in Hungary, Albrecht was confronted with a task that few men of his station, born and bred in the rarefied air of a dying empire, were ever truly prepared for: the stark, undeniable necessity of work. His former life had been a meticulously choreographed procession of ceremonial military duties, courtly functions, and the arcane language of royal precedents. It was a world of rustling silk, clinking metals, and the abstract weight of a 600-year-old dynasty. Now, the very survival of his family's remaining fortune depended not on parades or titles, but on the gritty, tangible reality of soil analysis, harvest yields, and labor disputes. For a man raised to be a living symbol, the prospect of trading the ballroom for the balance sheet could have been a profound, soul-crushing humiliation. But Albrecht met this new reality not with the bitter resignation of a fallen prince, but with a surprising steely pragmatism forged in the fires of his youth's apocalypse. The trauma of 1918, the cataclysm that had vaporized his entire world, had taught him a brutal and invaluable lesson. Empires could vanish, crowns could turn to dust, and titles could become hollow echoes overnight. Perhaps, in the quiet solitude of his new Hungarian manor, he finally faced the profound emptiness of a life based on ceremony alone. He threw himself into the monumental task of managing the vast Magyarovar estate not merely as a dynastic duty, but as a desperate, conscious search for tangible purpose. This was an existential quest. He was a man haunted by the ghostly weight of a lost world, and he sought solace not in nostalgia, but in the solid, earthy reality of a bushel of wheat, the rumble of a new tractor, the tangible satisfaction of a profitable year. He consciously traded the genealogical map of his ancestors, a chart of ghosts and abstract duties, for the topographical maps of his own estates, trading a world of memory for a world of mud, soil, and substance. This was no aristocrat playing at being a farmer. It was an intellectual applying his discipline to a new field. To the surprise of many who expected him to be a mere figurehead, enjoying the high life in Budapest, Albrecht immersed himself entirely in his new role. He did not treat it as a sinecure, but as a science. He would spend hours poring over agricultural journals, consulting with agronomists, and walking the fields himself, his boots caked in the very mud that now defined his existence. With the mind of a scholar, he rigorously studied crop rotation, soil enrichment techniques, and the mechanization of farming. He understood with a clarity many of his peers lacked that, in the harsh economic climate of post-Trianon Hungary, clinging to the old semi-feudal methods was a recipe for ruin. He invested heavily, transforming his lands into a model of modern agricultural efficiency, focusing on Hungary's most vital export, wheat. His efforts yielded results that resonated far beyond his own ledgers. Publicly, the stability and profitability of his estates became a crucial pillar of the local economy, a bastion of security providing employment for thousands of families during a time of widespread poverty and political turmoil. He earned a different kind of loyalty now, not one based on abstract allegiance to a distant crown, but on the tangible reality of a steady wage and a full larder. But privately, the true profit was measured in something far more valuable than currency: relevance. Each successful harvest, each logistical challenge overcome, was a defiant affirmation of his own worth. It was a testament to his competence, a value rooted in merit, not birthright. This was something that no law, no government, no shifting border could ever take away from him. In a very real sense, the last Archduke of the Teschen line was becoming the first modern agribusinessman of his family. This newfound status as a man of substance, not just of title, also granted him a formal and powerful role in the country's political life. He was given a seat in the restored House of Magnates, the aristocratic upper chamber of the Hungarian parliament. Here, in the halls of power in Budapest, he was no longer a decorative junior royal, but a voting member of the legislature whose voice carried weight. He became a prominent and articulate figure for the nation's conservative right wing. His political convictions were not abstract theories. They were deeply personal, forged from the scars of his own life. His fervent anti-communism was a direct, visceral reaction to the destructive chaos he had witnessed during Bela Kun's Red Terror. His deep belief in tradition and the Christian social order was a defense of the institutions he saw as the last bulwark against the nihilism that had consumed his world. And his quiet, heartfelt legitimism, his hope for a Habsburg restoration, was the last flickering ember of the world he was born into. It was a dangerous tightrope to walk in the complex political landscape of Horthy's kingless kingdom, where his very presence served as a living, breathing reminder of the absent king, making him a symbol of hope for some and a target of suspicion for others. For over a decade, Albrecht succeeded in a way his ancestors never had to. He thrived not on privilege, but on performance. This was not a resignation to fate. It was a conscious and triumphant act of self-reinvention. He had proven that a man's value lay not in the title he was born with, but in what he could build with his own mind and hands from the ashes of a fallen world. He had masterfully rebuilt a semblance of his former life, forging a new identity as a pragmatic manager and a respected political figure. But this new world, built on the solid foundations of work and politics, was still incomplete. A phantom limb from his old life remained, an ancient and inescapable duty that his new, modern identity could not erase. As he entered his 30s, this competent, self-made man found himself haunted by the oldest of expectations. As the last male of his line, a debt of bloodline remained. He had to marry and produce an heir. The choice he would make would be the most personal and the most revealing decision of his life. In the rarefied and calculating world of European royalty, marriage was never simply a private union. It was the ultimate diplomatic tool, the primary currency of power. For centuries, it was a cold transaction designed to cement alliances, consolidate territory, and produce heirs who would continue the great dynastic game. For a Habsburg archduke, even one in exile in the turbulent landscape of the early 20th century, this ancient principle still held a powerful, almost sacred sway. As the sole surviving male of the incredibly wealthy and prestigious Teschen line, the dynastic pressure on Albrecht to make a suitable marriage was enormous and unrelenting. A suitable match meant a princess from a reigning or formerly reigning Catholic dynasty, a Bourbon of Spain, a Braganza of Portugal, or a Savoy of Italy. Each potential bride was a piece on a grand geopolitical chessboard, and a successful union would have been a powerful statement, a signal to the monarchists of Hungary and the world that despite the loss of their empire, The House of Habsburg remained at the apex of the European social order, but Albrecht was a man irrevocably shaped by loss. He had spent his entire life having his destiny dictated to him by forces beyond his control, by his formidable parents, by the rigid expectations of an emperor, and ultimately by the merciless tides of war and revolution. The one domain where he felt he could still exercise a measure of personal freedom, a final bastion of self-determination, was in his private life. And it was here, in the matter of his own heart, that he chose to defy centuries of Habsburg tradition. In a world that demanded a political transaction, he committed the ultimate subversive act. He fell in love. His chosen bride was Irene Dora Lelbach de Leva, a woman from his own sophisticated social world in Hungary, but one who stood decisively outside the sacred circle of royalty. Born in 1897, the same year as Albrecht, she was the cultured daughter of a prominent but untitled jurist. By all accounts, she was intelligent, charming, and dignified, but she was not a princess. She had no royal blood. In the unforgiving lexicon of dynastic law, she was a commoner. For Albrecht, a man who had consciously rebuilt his identity from the ground up based on tangible merit, this was not just a marriage for love. It was a profound and quiet act of rebellion. It was the logical conclusion of the new life he had forged. Having already lost an empire, a homeland, and a military future, perhaps he now viewed the rigid, blood-obsessed rules of dynastic marriage as the final absurdity of a world that no longer existed. What, in reality, was the point of a grand political union to serve a phantom dynasty? What imaginary throne were his children meant to inherit? His decision was a powerful personal declaration of independence. If history would not grant him a kingdom of nations, he would build one for himself within the four walls of his own home. To contemplate such a union was a radical act, a direct challenge to the very ethos of his house. It would be a morganatic marriage, a union in which a person of high rank married someone of inferior status with the strict understanding that the lower-ranking spouse and any children would be forever barred from the titles, privileges, and inheritance of the royal partner. For the House of Habsburg, which for centuries had prized the purity of its bloodline above all else, a morganatic marriage was a stain, a public admission of dynastic failure. One can only imagine the stormy, difficult conversations that must have taken place within the family. His mother, the formidable Princess Isabella, a woman who had spent her life as a master strategist in the European marriage market, arranging brilliant matches for her 8 daughters, would have been deeply distressed. For her only son, the vessel of all her dynastic hopes to choose a bride who brought no political capital, no ancient title, no strategic advantage, would have been a bitter and incomprehensible disappointment. But Albrecht, now a man in his 30s, who had survived a world war and forged a new competent identity from its ashes, stood firm. His resolve was no longer that of a boy, but of a man who understood his own worth. To escape the inevitable scrutiny and disapproval of Central European society, the couple traveled to England. On May 8, 1930, in the quiet seaside resort town of Brighton, far from the gilded ballrooms of Vienna and the political salons of Budapest, they were married. The ceremony itself was the ultimate statement. What should have been a chapter in the history of nations, sealed with treaties and witnessed by ambassadors, was instead reduced to a private paragraph in the history of two people, witnessed only by the gray English she. It was not merely a marriage. It was an abdication from the grand, brutal theater of public history itself. Upon their return to Hungary, the consequences of his choice were made immediately and publicly clear. Irene was not granted the title of Archduchess, by the strict and unbending house laws of the Habsburgs. She was simply Mrs. Habsburg Lothringen. A minor title was later created for her by the exiled head of the house, but it was a mere consolation prize, a polite fiction. Still, for a time, their private kingdom thrived. They settled into the life of a wealthy, cultured, aristocratic couple, and by all accounts, their marriage was a happy one. But no private sanctuary, however defiantly built, could remain immune to the cataclysms of the 20th century. The world outside their sanctuary was once again growing dark. The global economic crash plunged Hungary into a deep depression, fueling the rise of political extremism. Across the border, Adolf Hitler was marching relentlessly toward power. In 1936, a ghost from Albrecht's past returned when his father died, and he inherited the now hollow title of Duke of Teschen. It was a title without a territory, a name without power, a painful reminder of the very dynastic world he had tried to escape. This symbolic inheritance, combined with the mounting pressures of a continent careening towards another war, appears to have taken its toll. The following year, in 1937, his marriage to Irene ended in divorce. The private kingdom he had so defiantly built for himself could not withstand the gathering storms. The quiet rebellion had ended in quiet failure. As Europe teetered on the brink, Albrecht found himself in a personal abyss. Alone once more, the last of his line, he was a mirror of the old world he represented, isolated, vulnerable, and facing a gathering storm. It was in this atmosphere of impending doom that he once again sought the solace of a family, a final attempt to build a personal fortress against the encroaching chaos. In the twilight years of the 1930s, Europe was holding its breath. The hopeful, hedonistic decade of the Roaring Twenties had given way to a grim era of economic depression, political extremism, and the looming certainty of another great war. In Germany, Adolf Hitler had consolidated his power, his aggressive ambitions, sending tremors of fear across the continent. For Archduke Albrecht, a man whose life had already been shattered by one world war, this new descent into darkness was a terrifying echo of the past. Having inherited a hollow ducal title from his father and seen his first marriage collapse into divorce, he was a man adrift, a king in a kingless kingdom that was itself being drawn into the vortex of Nazi Germany's orbit. It was in this climate of profound personal and political uncertainty that Albrecht once again sought to build a life for himself. He was 40 years old, the last male of his line, and the dynastic duty to produce an heir, however meaningless it now seemed, still weighed upon him. On May 7, 1938, less than a year after his divorce, he married for the second time. His bride was Katalin Bocskai de Felsobanya, a 29-year-old Hungarian woman from a respectable noble family. Like his first wife, Katalin was not of royal blood, making this another morganatic union. By now, any pretense of upholding the Grand Habsburg marriage traditions was gone. Albrecht was no longer playing a dynastic game on the European stage. He was simply a man seeking companionship and a family in a world that was falling apart. Their marriage took place just 2 months after Hitler's Anschluss, the annexation of Austria into the German Reich. Vienna, the glittering capital of Albrecht's youth in the heart of the old empire, was now a provincial city in Nazi Germany, its streets draped in swastikas. The name Habsburg was now more dangerous than ever. For Albrecht, watching from across the border in Hungary, this must have felt like a final brutal desecration of his past. The world he had lost in 1918 was not just gone, it was being systematically erased and replaced by a monstrous new order. While some anecdotal tales suggest the wedding was a clandestine affair to avoid the notice of the Gestapo, The reality was that Albrecht's life was now almost entirely confined to his Hungarian estates, his political influence shrinking as Hungary fell ever deeper under German sway. Yet for a brief, fleeting moment, it seemed that Albrecht had found a measure of the peace he had always craved. His marriage to Catalin was fruitful. In 1940, their first child, a daughter named Charlotte, was born. 2 years later, in 1942, a second daughter, Ildiko, followed. After a lifetime of lonely privilege and public duty, Albrecht was finally a father. He finally had a domain that was truly his own, not a duchy of thousands of hectares, but a fragile kingdom confined to the nursery, a final sanctuary of light against the howling winter of a world at war. He dedicated himself to his role as a landowner, doing what he could to shield his tenants and his properties from the deprivations of the conflict. As Hungary was an Axis power, his lands were a vital source of food for the war effort, and his primary role was to maintain agricultural production. He was no longer a soldier on the front lines, but an administrator on the home front, a quiet steward trying to preserve a sliver of the old world against the howling storm. But the storm was drawing closer. As the tide of the Second World War turned against Germany, Hungary's position became increasingly precarious. Regent Horthy, realizing he had backed the losing side, began to secretly negotiate with the Allies for a separate peace. Hitler, learning of this betrayal, was enraged. In March 1944, the Wehrmacht rolled into Hungary, and the country became an occupied territory. The fragile illusion of Hungarian sovereignty was shattered. What followed was one of the darkest chapters in the nation's history. Under German occupation, the Holocaust was brutally implemented in Hungary, and hundreds of thousands of Hungarian Jews were rounded up and sent to their deaths in Auschwitz. For the old Hungarian aristocracy, including Albrecht, this was the beginning of the end. Their traditional authority was swept aside by the German occupiers and their Hungarian fascist puppets, the Arrow Cross Party. As a prominent Habsburg and a devout Catholic, Albrecht was an object of inherent suspicion to the pagan, anti-aristocratic ideology of the Nazis. His world became one of daily fear and uncertainty. The war was no longer a distant conflict. It was on his doorstep. By late 1944, the war had arrived in Hungary with apocalyptic force. The Soviet Red Army, having pushed the Germans back across Eastern Europe, crossed the Hungarian border and began a relentless advance. The fighting was savage, particularly the brutal siege of Budapest, which left the once beautiful capital in ruins. For Albrecht and his family, trapped on their estates between the retreating Germans and the advancing Soviets, there was nowhere to run. When the war in Europe finally ended in May 1945, Hungary was liberated by the Soviet Union. But it was a liberation that quickly turned into a new form of occupation. The Red Army was not there to restore the old order. It was there to create a new one in Moscow's image. For the Hungarian landowning class, the verdict was swift and merciless. They were branded as class enemies, exploiters of the people, and relics of a decadent past. The new communist-dominated government, under the watchful eye of Soviet commissars, immediately passed sweeping land reform laws. The great estates that had been the foundation of the Hungarian aristocracy for centuries were summarily confiscated and nationalized. The First War had hollowed him out, taking his titles and his future. The Second War came to finish the job, stripping away all that was left: his home, his lands, his last connection to a tangible past. History, it seemed, was a patient executioner. The colossal wealth of the Teschen line, which had survived the fall of an empire, was now gone forever, swallowed by the new communist imperium. At the age of 48, Archduke Albrecht was not just an exile, he was a pauper and a refugee. With his wife and 2 young daughters, he was forced to flee his adopted homeland, leaving behind every last remnant of his former life. The second great cataclysm of the 20th century had completed the work of the first. There was nothing left. The flight from communist Hungary was a desperate, humiliating scramble for survival. The world Albrecht and his family escaped into was a continent of rubble and displaced persons. The old networks of aristocratic kinship that had once spanned Europe were in tatters. For a man who had never known anything but immense wealth, the reality of being a penniless refugee was a brutal shock. After a period of uncertainty, seeking refuge where they could in a shattered Austria, the family made the decision that so many other displaced Europeans made in the post-war years. They would leave the old world behind entirely and seek a new life across the ocean. Their journey took them to South America, a continent physically untouched by the war, and a magnet for émigrés of all kinds, from Nazi war criminals fleeing justice to Jewish survivors of the Holocaust, to the scattered remnants of the European aristocracy. After a brief time in Mexico, the family eventually settled in Argentina, which under President Juan Perón had become a primary destination for Central European refugees. But the move to a new world could not save his fracturing family. The immense strain of losing everything, of being cast into exile and poverty, proved fatal to his marriage. The shared trauma did not bring Albrecht and Catalin closer together. It drove them apart. In 1951, while living in Buenos Aires, they were divorced. Once again, Albrecht was alone, his family broken, his life in ruins. Yet, even in this final desolate chapter of his life, he seemed driven by a deep human need for connection and continuity. On March 8, 1951, at the age of 53, he married for a third and final time. His new wife was Lydia Strauss-Dorner. Their union was a quiet affair, a world away, not just from the imperial spectacles of his youth, but even from the genteel aristocratic weddings of his Hungarian years. It was the marriage of 2 survivors, 2 displaced people trying to build a small haven in a foreign land. And this final marriage gave Albrecht the one thing his duty had always demanded: a son. The long-awaited male heir had finally arrived, decades too late to claim a kingdom that had already vanished. The boy would not inherit a fortune, but a ghost, not a title, but the crushing weight of its echo. His only birthright was a famous name and the profound silent tragedy it now represented. In Buenos Aires, Albrecht lived out his final years in quiet obscurity. He was an active member of the city's vibrant community of German and Austro-Hungarian immigrants. In this small, insular world, he was still treated with the deference due to an archduke. The Archduke of Austria had been reduced to the mayor of a phantom kingdom. In the cafes of Buenos Aires, surrounded by fellow exiles, he was a living relic, a ghost holding court among other ghosts. He participated in their cultural societies, attended their balls, and helped to keep alive the traditions of a homeland he would never see again. It was a life of nostalgia, a life lived almost entirely in the past. The years of turmoil, loss, and stress had taken a severe toll on his health. On July 23, 1955, in Buenos Aires, just one day shy of his 58th birthday, Archduke Albrecht Franz, the last titular Duke of Teschen, died. His death went largely unnoticed by the world. He was buried in a local cemetery, his final resting place, a simple grave, thousands of miles from the magnificent imperial crypt in Vienna, where his ancestors lay in their ornate sarcophagi. His death marked the quiet, unceremonious end of a powerful branch of the House of Habsburg. He was the last male of the Teschen line. His children, the 2 daughters from his second marriage and the son from his third, would grow up and live their lives not as archdukes and archduchesses, but as ordinary citizens of the modern world, scattered between Europe and South America. They carried with them the memory of a name that had once commanded armies and ruled over nations, a name that had finally been submerged by the relentless tides of history. The death of Archduke Albrecht Franz in Buenos Aires in 1955 marked the quiet end of the Teschen line of the House of Habsburg. His life and legacy are defined by a central debate over his 2 morganatic marriages. Was he a modern rebel, choosing personal happiness over the obsolete duties of a fallen empire, or was he a failure, shirking his responsibility to continue the dynasty? The final verdict is that he was neither a rebel nor a failure. He was the first casualty of his own inheritance, a man so thoroughly unmade by history that he spent the rest of his life pragmatically seeking the simple substance of a family after the grand performance of his public world was canceled forever. The most profound consequence of his choices was the fate of his only son, Rudolf. Born an heir to nothing, an archduke without an empire, he lived a quiet life in Argentina. His death at age 40, unmarried and childless, extinguished the direct male line forever. Albrecht's story is a symbol of the displaced European aristocracy of the 20th century. This is best captured by his final resting place, not in the magnificent imperial crypt in Vienna among his ancestors, but in a simple grave in Buenos Aires. It is a testament not to the archduke he was born to be, but to the man he became, the final fading echo of a lost world.